response among the peasantry. The memory of the pre-colonial period is still very much alive in the villages. Mothers still hum to their children the songs which accompanied the warriors as they set off to fight the colonizer. At the age of 12 or 13, the young villagers know by heart the names of the elders who took part in the last revolt, and the dreams in the douars and villages are not those of the children in cities dreaming of luxury goods or passing their exams, but dreams of identification with such and such a hero whose heroic death still brings tears to their eyes. I know he's mentioned douars a few times. Douars. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry. Oh, there's so much shit I can't pronounce. I'm sorry. But they're basically hamlets. They're rural, peasant. They're similar to villages, but I think smaller. At a time when the nationalist parties are endeavoring to organize the embryonic working class in the towns, we are witnessing apparently inexplicable social unrest in the interior. We can take as an example the infamous 1947 insurrection in Madagascar. The colonial services stated categorically that it was the peasant revolt. It was a peasant revolt. In fact, we now know that things, as always, were much more complex. During the Second World War, the major colonial companies extended their influence and grabbed any remaining land. There was also talk at the same period of the possible settlement on the island of Jewish, Kabyle, and West Indian refugees. The rumor also spread of an imminent invasion of the island by the whites from South Africa, abetted by the colonists. After the war, therefore, the candidates on the nationalist ticket were triumphantly elected. Immediately afterwards, factions of the MDRM party, Mouvement Démocratique de la Rénovation Malgache, underwent repression. In order to achieve their ends, the colonial authorities employed the usual methods: mass arrests, intertribal racist propaganda, and the creation of a party with the unorganized factions of the lumpen proletariat. This party, called the Disinherited of Madagascar, or PADSM, and its decidedly provocative actions, was to provide the colonial authorities with the legal pretext it needed to maintain law and order. Such a premeditated commonplace operation as eliminating a political party, however, here took on gigantic proportions. On the defensive for 3 or 4 years, the rural masses suddenly felt themselves in mortal danger and decided to violently resist the colonial forces, armed with spears and more often with sticks and stones. The population rose up in a widespread revolt with the aim of national liberation. We know how it ended. Such armed revolts constitute but one of the methods used by the rural masses to join the national struggle. In some cases, the peasants act as a relay following the unrest in the towns where the nationalist party is the object of police repression. The news reaches the interior, exaggerated out of all proportion. Leaders arrested, others gunned down, the city running red with the blood of blacks, the poor white settlers swimming in Arab blood. All of the pent-up hatred, all the exasperated hatred, then explodes. The local police station is taken over, the officers hacked to pieces, the elementary teacher murdered, the doctor gets away with his life only because he is absent, etc., etc. Pacifying troops are dispatched to the field, the Air Force drops bombs, the banner of revolt is then unfurled, the old warrior traditions resurface, the women cheer on the men who band together, masses into the national struggle. We've seen that the majority of nationalist parties have not written the need for armed intervention into their propaganda. They are not opposed to a sustained revolt, but they leave it up to the spontaneity of the rural masses. In other words, their attitude towards these new developments is as if they were heaven sent, praying. They continue. They exploit this godsend, but make no attempt to organize the rebellion. They do not dispatch agents in the interior to politicize the masses, to enlighten their consciousness, or raise the struggle to a higher level. They hope that, swept along by its own momentum, the action of the masses will not flag. There is no contamination of the rural movement by the urban movement. Each side evolves according to its own dialectic. At a time when the rural masses are totally receptive, the nationalist parties make no attempt to introduce them to an agenda. They have no objective to offer and simply hope that the movement will continue indefinitely and that the bombardment will not win the day. We thus see that the nationalist parties do not make use of even this opportunity to integrate the rural masses and raise their political awareness as well as their struggle to a higher level. They stubbornly maintain their criminal position of distrust with regard to the interior. The political cadres hole up in the towns and make clear to the colonial authorities they have no connections with the rebels or else leave the country. Seldom do they join forces with the people in the mountains. In Kenya, for example, during the Mau Mau insurrection, no known nationalist claimed he was a member of the movement or attempted to defend it. There are no constructive talks, no confrontation between the different social strata of the nation. Once independence has been achieved, after repression of the rural masses and collusion between the colonial authorities and the nationalist parties, we find this mutual incomprehension exacerbated. The peasantry balk at the structural reforms proposed by the government as well as the objectively progressive social innovations, precisely because the current leaders of the regime did not explain to the people during the colonial period the party objectives, national policy, and international issues, etc. The mistrust felt by the rural population of the traditional leaders toward the nationalist parties during the colonial period is matched by equal hostility during the national period. The colonialist secret service, which is still at work after independence, foments discontent and still manages to create serious difficulties for the young governments. When all is said and done, the government is merely paying for its idleness during the liberation period and its enduring contempt for the peasantry. The nation may well have a rational, even progressive head, but its huge body remains retarded, rebellious, and recalcitrant. So, after the nationalist parties have failed to organize the peasantry, the peasants end up organizing themselves and create an insurrectionary movement. The colonial authorities arrest and attack the nationalist is great, therefore, to crush this body by centralizing the administration and keeping a firm control over the people. This is one of the reasons why we often hear that the underdeveloped countries need a dose of dictatorship. The leaders distrust the rural masses. The distrust, moreover, can take on serious proportions, such as the case for certain governments that, long after national independence, consider the interior as an unpacified region where the head of state and his ministers only venture during army maneuvers. The interior is considered a virtual terra incognita. Paradoxically, the national government's attitude towards the rural masses is reminiscent in some ways of the colonial power. We are not too sure how the masses will react. We need to use the lash if we want to take this country out of the dark ages. The young leaders are not afraid to say, but as we have seen, the political parties' disregard for the rural masses during colonial period can only be prejudicial to national unity and to setting rapidly the nation in motion. Sometimes colonialism endeavors to diversify and dislocate the nationalist upsurge. Instead of stirring up the sheikhs and the chiefs against the revolutionaries in the towns, the native bureaus organize the tribes and religious brotherhoods into parties, confronted with an urban party which is beginning to embody the will of the nation and constitute a threat to the colonial regime. Factions are born, and sympathies and parties based on tribe and region emerge. The entire tribe is transformed into a political party in close consultation with the colonialists. Roundtable discussions can now begin. The party of national unity is swamped by the very number of political factions. The tribal parties opposed centralization and unity and denounce the one-party dictatorship. Later on, the same tactics will be used by the national opposition. The occupier has already made his choice from the 2 or 3 nationalist parties who led the liberation struggle. The method of choice is typical. Once a party has achieved national unanimity and has emerged as the sole negotiator, the occupier begins his maneuvering and delays negotiations as long as possible. The delay is used to whittle away the party's demands and obtains concessions from the leadership to remove certain extremist elements. If, however, no single party emerges, the occupier is contented to favor the one which seems to him to be the most reasonable. The nationalist parties, which were excluded from the negotiations, then loudly denounce the agreement and conclude between the other party and the occupier. The party which takes over from the occupier, conscious of the danger of the rival party's vague, strictly demagogic positions, endeavors to dismantle and outlaw it. The persecuted party has no other alternative but to take refuge in the periphery of the towns and in the interior. It attempts to stir up the rural masses against the mercenaries of the coast and the corrupt elements of in the capital. Any excuse is good enough, from religious arguments to the tradition-breaking class and obscure mass of the peasantry. Conversely, in some cases the opposition no longer seeks support from the rural masses, but from the progressive elements of the young nation's labor unions. In this case, the government calls upon the masses to resist the workers' demands, calling them rash, anti-traditionalist maneuvers. The observations we have noted concerning the political parties can now be applied to the labor unions, mutatis mutandis. The first labor unions in the colonial territories are usually local branches of their metropolitan counterparts, and their slogans echo those of the metropolis. Once the crucial phase of the liberation struggle begins to take shape, a group of indigenous union leaders decides to create a national labor movement. The locals desert en masse to the previous organization imported from the metropolis. The formation of this union is another way for the urban population to exert pressure on the colonial authorities. We have already said that the proletariat in the colonies is embryonic and represents the most privileged faction of the population. The national labor unions born out of the liberation struggle are union organizations and their programs. Their program is above all political and nationalist, but this national union born during the decisive phase of the fight for independence is, in fact, the legal enlistment of dynamic, politically conscious nationalist elements. The rural masses, despite the political parties, continue to be on the sidelines. There is, of course, an agricultural workers' union, but such a formation is content to satisfy the formal need for a united front against colonialism. The union leaders who began their careers in the context of the metropolitan unions are at a loss when it comes to organizing the rural masses. They've lost touch with the peasantry and are mainly concerned with enlisting steelworkers, dockers, and civil servants in the utilities sector, etc. During the colonial phase, the nationalist labor unions represent a spectacular strike force. In the towns, these unions can paralyze or at least disrupt at any moment the colonialist economy. Since the European settlements are mostly confined to the towns, the psychological repercussions are considerable. No gas, no electricity, no garbage pickup, and produce lies rotting on the wharfs. These metropolitan enclaves, which the towns represent in the colonial context, are profoundly affected by this labor unrest. The stronghold of colonialism, the capital, has difficulty withstanding such a battering, but the rural masses of the interior remain unaffected by this confrontation. There is therefore a clear disproportion from the national point of view between the importance of labor unions and the rest of the nation. After independence, the workers enlisted in the unions have the impression of running on empty. Once the limited objectives they set themselves have been achieved, they prove to be extremely precarious given the huge task of nation building. Faced with the national bourgeoisie, whose relations with the government are often very close, the union leaders discover they can no longer confine themselves to labor disputes. Congenitally isolated from the rural masses, incapable of extending their influence beyond the urban periphery, the unions adopt an increasingly political stance. In fact, they become political candidates. They endeavor by every means possible to drive the bourgeoisie into a corner. Protests are made against keeping foreign bases on national soil. Commercial deals are exposed, and criticism is voiced against the national government's foreign policy. their social demands were to be expressed, they would scandalize the rest of the nation. These workers are in fact pampered by the regime. They represent the most well-to-do fraction of the people. Any unrest aimed at winning improved living standards for the laborers and the dock workers would not only be unpopular, but might very well stir up the hostility of the disinherited rural population. The unions banned from union activities make no headway. This malaise conveys the objective need for a social program which, at long last, concerns the entire nation. The unions suddenly discover that the interior must also be enlightened and organized, but since they never bothered to establish working links between their organization and the peasantry, who represent the only spontaneously revolutionary force in the country, the unions proved to be ineffective and realized the anachronistic nature of their program. The union leaders immersed in worker control politics inevitably reach the union leaders immersed in worker control politics inevitably reach the preparatory stage for a coup d'etat. But here, again, the interior is excluded. It is a showdown restricted to the but here again, the interior is excluded. It is a showdown restricted to the national bourgeoisie and the unionized workers' movement. The national bourgeoisie, appropriating the old traditions of colonialism, flexes its military and police muscle, whereas the unions organize meetings and mobilize tens of thousands of their members. The peasants shrug their shoulders as they muse over the national bourgeoisie and these workers who, after all, have enough to eat. The peasants shrug their shoulders, for they realize that both parties treat them as a makeshift force. The unions, the parties, and the government, in a kind of immoral Machiavellianism, use the peasant masses as a blind, inert force of intervention, as a kind of brute force. The prior fact that the nationalist parties and the proletarian movements never bothered to adequately and materially address the interior's concerns has lasting repercussions. Fanon gives us a few ways that this pans out, but in every single one, the peasantry is leveraged by some power against the rest of the nation, be it the party in power, the opposition party, which was aligned with the colonizers, or the unions. No one ever successfully organized the peasantry, and thus national unity cannot occur. Thank you for watching this reading of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. If you like what I do, please consider giving a like to the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to see more of what I do or want to support me, check out all my links in the description. Those include my music, ways to follow me on Twitch and Twitter, and also ways you can maybe throw me a couple bucks. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.